So Madame Blavatsky made a pretty big splash in the understanding of science and especially in the understanding of myth by gathering these sources from outside of Europe into the broader body of work for European myth. And so the source for her of all of her knowledge is not some kind of specific revelation so much as she considered that the greater figures of history and especially religious history were directly part of her group of theosophy. And so her writings are presented as a revelation from these historical figures. So along the text, you will find references to Jesus and Abraham and Moses, as much as Buddha and Confucius, Lao Tzu, and pretty much anyone who is vaguely involved in understanding of religious ideas, including a character that we have seen previously in this class. The writer is aware that those specialists whose computations of the ages of the globe and man are the most liberal have always had their share majority against them. But this proves very little, since the majority rarely, if ever, turns out to be right in the long run. Harvey stood alone for many years. The advocates for crossing the Atlantic with steamers were in danger of ending their days in a lunatic asylum. Mesmer is classed to this day in the encyclopedias, along with Cagliostro and Saint Germain, as a charlatan and impostor. And now that Misters Charcot and Richet have vindicated Mesmer's claims, and the mesmerism under the new name "quote unquote" hypnotism, a false noise on the very old face, is accepted by science, it does not strengthen our respect for that majority when we see the ease and unconcern with which members treat of hypnotism or telepathic impacts and its other phenomena. They speak of it, in short, as if they had believed therein since the days of Solomon and had not, only a few years ago, called its votaries lunatics and impostors. You might remember Mesmer, Franz Mesmer, from mesmerism and hypnotism fame from previously. So the idea that you could use these magical magnetic techniques to improve the quality of life of people. And according to her, Mesmer is one of the founders of Theosophy and one of the masters, anyway, that gave her some of her revelations. Um, it may be interesting to see how this actually plays out, especially in comparison with the stuff that we have mentioned before, because this is a scientific idea. And as she points out here, there are some scientists who quote unquote vindicated Mesmer. So she mentions Charcot and Richet. Both of them are very important figures in medical history. Richet was a physiologist. He is the inventor of the word ectoplasm. If you've ever watched Ghostbusters, the whole idea of ectoplasm that comes from him. He was very interested in understanding in cognition, and especially one specific phenomena, which is sleepwalking or somnambulism. He was believing that the specific psychic makeup of people allowed them to have a very specific experience through sleep. And he, in other words, did not consider it, as most people did during that time, as somewhat of a spirit possession, but rather he saw that as a kind of a sixth sense, as a supernatural or supernormal form of knowledge, essentially. So people are able to move when they sleep because they have this extra sense that allows them to move when they sleep. Um, on the downside of Richer, he also believed that that people of color, all of them were inferior, and as evidenced by the fact that they do not experience sleepwalking and other quote unquote supernatural forms. So, generally speaking, at this point in time, Richer is not quite well acclaimed as far as his science is concerned. Although he made some important discoveries, he's also kind of widely reviled as a result of it. But his main contribution for us goes onto the idea of sleepwalking, and also the idea that there's a sort of a tension between knowing things and knowing things in a sensory manner, knowing things intellectually, if you will, and knowing things sensibly. Um, and so the possibility that you might be able to have those senses kind of heightened and perhaps have again a privileged view into mankind through these senses was something that was very important to him, and he proposed that somnambulism, sleepwalking, could be cured through hypnosis. So the idea that hypnosis would give you access to that sixth sense and allow you to get control of it. Um, so he was not quite in the same sense as Mesmer, not quite trying to think of it as a fluid thing that is within your brain, so much as trying to make sense out of the limit of science, if you will. So the idea of um, the idea of seeing the world in a supernatural manner was very important to him, and was picked up by another scientist, Charcot, mentioned here, who was a neurologist. Charcot is the person who discovered ALS. In France, the ALS is called Charcot's illness. As a result of him, another one of his of Charcot's claim to fame was that he was a co-worker with Gilles de la Tourette, who identified Tourette's syndrome. Um, so another important figure in medicine, a lot better recognized than Richer for sure. But Charcot was looking at these kind of psychiatric phenomena from the point of view of neurology. So from the point of view of the brain, and trying to understand how the brain might work in a sense that is not entirely controlled or controllable by people, that they might have more brain power that they might imagine than they have. Um, Although he was not, so he never considered himself a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything of the sort. Um, Charcot is also quite well remembered for his study of hysteria. The picture here from one of his patients who was diagnosed with hysteria, and that Charcot argued that hysteria was a neurological disorder, something that had again a root in the brain, rather than as it works with hysteria in the uterus in another part of the body. And so for you may be aware of this, but you may not, that for a very long time, hysteria was diagnosed as an exclusively female illness, and that women who were judged hysterical were sent to sanitariums, or essentially mental facilities, to kind of keep them out of society, because hysteria was seen as a danger to society. And so Charcot was studying hysteria, and placed it within the brain rather than another part of the body, and he also studied it more specifically in a hospital school in France to essentially recognize the quote unquote disease that it is, which it is not so much a disease, and it's really not a condition in any kind of way. But Charcot was instrumental in discovering that, especially because he started observing it from the brain and kind of separating what he called kind of grand hypnotism and little or small hypnotism. That so hysterical conditions were a form of grand hypnotism. So again, the brain is acting outside of its usual capacity, creating a an extremely strong reaction. Um, so that also meant that, for example, as Charcot argued, that men could absolutely be hysterical, that there's no gender difference there, and that the biggest problem in his own era of medicine was their lack of attention to the brain, and the fact that, for example, people who might have gone through severe trauma would be judged hysterical, and of course that would be a predecessor to our understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, so the root cause, as Charcot sees it, of quote unquote hysteric condition in hypnotism is not quite right, but you have to understand hypnotism in the sense of the broader brain capacity and our knowledge of the brain, which when they were writing in the 19th century were very limited compared to what we have now. And as much as Madame Blavatsky is correct that that both Charcot and Richet were, to a certain extent, um, influenced by Mesmer in their research, they certainly did not vindicate that hypnotism was a cure to anything, and that hypnotism was real. They just extended the understanding that we had of the brain. That being said, it does contribute to the understanding of the kind of a privileged place of these maverick, the people who are doing research in fields that are not well established, and kind of looking at these. Um, Again, the word we used in the previous video was esoteric or sometimes occult, but either way, in these kind of non-mainstream ideas and using these non-mainstream ideas to solve a mainstream predicament or question, which is very much what Madame Blavatsky did, and which is what these doctor did as well. Um, to me, most importantly, to us at this point, is that this kind of story where you connect these dots very loosely to make a larger connection out of it goes back to our idea of myth, really, because this is kind of the myth that Madame Blavatsky was hooking on to, the idea that Franz Mesmer contributed to something of medicine, which helped her in turn create a philosophical slash religious system, is only to be understood as true in the widest, the broadest of terms. I mean, there's no real connections there. But but it is something that is kind of solving a question that she had, a problem that she had in her own life, in her own upbringing. The idea of people being able to solve their issues through somewhat of a practice of the self. And Joseph Campbell also pointed out that in this regard, mythology is always a part of this spiritual development of people, even in the broadest of terms. It's always been the prime function of mythology and rites to supply the symbols that carry the human spirit forward, in counteraction to those other constant human fantasies that tend to tie it back. In fact, it may well be that the very high incidence of neuroticism among ourselves follows from the decline among us of such effective spiritual aid. We remain fixated on the exorcised images of our infancy and hence disinclined to the necessary passages of our adulthood. And so in this context, the knowledge of the myth, the access to the myth and mythology, and even in the context of Madame Blavatsky as a secret society, secret brotherhood, or some kind of a occult group that has achieved a higher level of consciousness is really nothing new, and Theosophy is just inscribing itself in this tradition. The same thing that happens with Freemasonry and Illuminati and any other kind of modern conspiracy theory that you might have heard of. And these groups are just religious groups. They just so happen to be religious groups that were not mainstream and both, well, Illuminati being a quote unquote Freemasonry group, uh, um, an ancient one, by the way, one that doesn't exist currently. It might be worth noting. Um, the Freemasons were just in fact a religious group, a religious practice that was just set aside because it caused political problems in Europe, because they opposed the monarchy, because they had very liberal ideas about politics and religion, and they became kind of reviled in European intellectual circles at a time, and eventually found a home in the United States. Well, the idea that these groups survived through their very unique religious practice, and especially the mythology behind it, and there is certainly a mythology of Freemasonry, which appears as these kind of villains in history that is very important. So the connection kind of reaches into more scientific studies of religion and mythology, of course, because bringing these new documents into the mainstream mythological process has also made people more aware of exactly how these Gnostic documents or Eastern documents could be used for a much larger process of people finding themselves in a way. Mircea Eliade, that we have mentioned before, had his own experience going to India and especially discovering yoga. He wrote several books about how yoga helped him, and he was very interested in what Madame Blavatsky had to say about Indian religion and yoga, although he was not completely a fan of her work. The modern world believed in evolution and consequently in an infinite progress. Madame Blavatsky presented a theory of indefinite spiritual evolution through metempsychosis and progressive initiation. She claimed that during her purported sojourn in Tibet, she had received the primordial, that is, Asiatic and even supraterrestrial revelation. But I must interrupt at this point to observe that if there is anything characteristic of all Eastern traditions, it is precisely an anti-evolutionistic conception of the spiritual life. Moreover, Madame Blavatsky believed in the necessity of bridging positive material quote-unquote proofs to substantiate the theosophical doctrine, and she regularly quote-unquote materialized messages from her mysterious Mahatmas, masters, in Tibet. These messages, though written in English and on ordinary paper, had nevertheless the prestige of a solid material fact and convinced a great number of apparently intelligent people of the authenticity of Madame Blavatsky's secret doctrine. So, not a fan, mostly because he had experienced it himself and he kind of knew exactly where she was going with that. But Mircea Eliade is not perfect either. As I've said before, he became a nationalist and a Nazi sympathizer towards the end of World War II. So the kind of a little bit of sweeping in front of his front door that he has to do here. But the larger point remains of understanding the current scientific process, the current religious process, and turning that um, into a new form of energy, if you will, or creative process. And in fact, this is probably the most important discovery that we are going to make at this point is that, of course, myth is not something that we people just suffer through, but rather something that we actively create, that we have an intentional role in making. And Merritt points out that, of course, the myth is a creation by humans. This is not something that is revealed, and so not something that comes to us in a magic way. That this is a creation that we have. The fact that this part of the performance goes by the name "frightening the women" affords an eloquent proof of an intention on their part, which they are doubtless fully competent of render effective. In short, they see to it that the women have the bzik. It is conducive to the discipline. Just so at Abeokuta in West Africa, the dread god Or, who speaks through the bull roarer, punishes gadding wives, so social butterfly wives, With a thoroughness characteristic of the blood-stained corner of the world, it remains to note that if feminine nerves are weak, there is likewise a feminine curiosity which is strong and must be satisfied. Hence, myth is resorted to, if that be the proper name for a barefaced piece of quote-unquote organized hypocrisy. So, rather stern assessment here of myth as an organized hypocrisy, but probably, especially once you remove the religious aspects of it, something that is much closer to the modern understanding that we have of the myth as something that is understood as a lie. So the fact that people are able to look backward at the past, however mythical, and also look at their own current traditions and practices and try to combine those to figure out a way through it and figure out a way to the future is something that is obviously very important to the constitution of our myth. And Merit, in another word, points out that it is, in fact, an existential need that we have for myth. Probably worth mentioning that Merritt was the successor to E.B. Tyler in anthropology at Oxford, and he was kind of influenced by Tyler in many respects, but also kind of to change Tyler's history of religion and those ideas of animism that we have mentioned before. Merritt was mostly influenced by the ideas about the supernatural, and especially the kind of again extra sensory relationship that we have to the supernatural that make us realize just how much we know and how much we don't know. And so he also says in the presentiment of luck or the fear of witchcraft or the awe associated with initiation ceremony, we have examples of universal feelings that the folklorist may study near at hand if he have the inward seeking temper and can converse with the peasants in his own idiom. Survivals in folklore then are no mere wreckage of the past, but are likewise symptomatic of those tendencies in our common human nature which have the best sense of surviving in the long run. So myth is very helpful and something that we are going to have to reckon with in terms of our own existence. When we come back after the break, we'll go a little bit further into specific forms of myth and heroes, which are usually excerpts from the myth.